Ellen Whitfield's hands shook as she read the letter for the third time, and no matter how many times she read it, the words did not change. Her rent was 2 months overdue, and the landlord had given her until the end of the week to pay or leave the small flat she shared with her mother. She folded the letter and pressed it into her coat pocket, feeling her chest tighten as she stepped out into the cold evening air of the town of Ashcombe. The streets were nearly empty at that hour. A light drizzle had started to fall, and the gas lamps along the road cast long shadows across the wet cobblestones. Ellen pulled her coat tighter and walked quickly, her mind racing through numbers that never seemed to add up. She worked as a cleaner at the local school, and the wages barely covered food, let alone rent and her mother's medicine. Her mother, Dorothy, had been unwell for almost a year now. The doctor said it was her heart, and that she needed rest, warmth, and medicine that cost more than Ellen earned in 2 weeks. Every evening, Ellen returned home to find her mother sitting by the window, waiting, trying to smile as though nothing was wrong, even though both of them knew how close they were to losing everything. As Ellen crossed the old stone bridge near the edge of town, something caught her eye. A small glint of gold, lying half hidden in a crack between the stones. She stopped walking and knelt down, brushing away a few fallen leaves. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a pendant, gold, shaped like a teardrop, with a small red stone set in its center. It looked old, delicate, and clearly valuable. She picked it up slowly, turning it over in her fingers. The metal was cool and smooth, polished by years of care. There was no chain attached, only the pendant itself, as though it had been torn free in a hurry, or dropped by accident. Ellen looked around, but the bridge was empty. No footsteps, no voices, nobody rushing back to search for something they had lost. For a long moment, she simply stood there, staring at the pendant in her palm. Her first thought was of her landlord's letter, still folded in her pocket. A piece of gold like this could be sold for enough money to pay off her debt and buy weeks, maybe months, of proper food and medicine for her mother. The thought arrived quickly, almost without her permission, and it frightened her a little, how easily it had come. She closed her fingers around the pendant and continued walking, faster now, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. By the time she reached her front door, she had already imagined a dozen different ways the money could save her. She could see her mother resting comfortably, warm and fed, no longer forced to hide her pain behind a tired smile. Inside, the flat was quiet, except for the soft ticking of an old clock on the wall. Dorothy was asleep in her chair, a blanket pulled over her knees, her breathing slow and even. Ellen stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her mother's chest rise and fall, and she felt a wave of love and fear mixed together inside her, so strong it almost made her dizzy. She sat down at the small kitchen table and placed the pendant in front of her, studying it under the dim light of the lamp. It really was beautiful, finely made, the kind of thing that belonged to someone with money and history, not to 2 women barely scraping by in a rented flat. She wondered who had lost it and how they must be feeling right now, searching, perhaps frantic, perhaps not even aware yet that it was gone. A quiet voice inside her, one she recognized from years of sitting beside her mother in the small church at the end of the street, whispered that this was not truly hers to keep. She tried to push the thought aside, telling herself that whoever had lost it was surely wealthy enough not to miss it too badly, that finding it was simply good fortune, a stroke of luck she desperately needed. But the voice did not go away. It stayed with her as she made a simple dinner of bread and soup, as she washed the dishes, as she helped her mother into bed for the night. Every time she looked at the pendant sitting on the table, she felt a small tug of guilt, even though she had done nothing wrong yet. She had only found it. She had not decided anything. Still, the temptation grew heavier as the night went on. She thought about the jeweler on Milton Street, a quiet, careful man named Harold Gray, who had once told her that he paid fair prices for old gold pieces. She imagined walking into his shop, placing the pendant on the counter, and walking out with enough money to solve every problem pressing down on her. It would be so simple, so quick. She lay awake long after her mother had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, the pendant resting on the small table beside her bed, where she could see it in the moonlight. Its red stone seemed to catch even the faintest light, glowing softly, almost as though it were watching her, waiting to see what she would choose to do. In the morning, Ellen woke early, before the sun had fully risen, and found herself still thinking about the pendant. She dressed quietly, checked on her mother, who was resting peacefully, and made her way to work at the school, the pendant tucked carefully into the pocket of her apron. All day, as she swept floors and wiped down tables, her mind kept drifting back to it, weighing the choice she knew she would eventually have to make. During her lunch break, she sat alone in the small staff room, turning the pendant over in her hands again. A young teacher named Charlotte Price walked in, noticed the pendant, and asked where she had found something so fine. Ellen explained briefly, and Charlotte's eyes widened with excitement, urging her to sell it quickly before anyone came looking. "It's yours now," she said. "You found it. That's how these things work." Ellen forced a small smile and said nothing more, but Charlotte's words stayed with her the rest of the day, mixing uncomfortably with the quiet voice that told her something entirely different. By the time she walked home that evening, her mind felt like a battlefield, one side pulling her toward relief and comfort, the other toward a kind of honesty she had been raised to value above almost everything else. When she arrived home, her mother was sitting up, looking a little stronger than the day before, and asked gently what was troubling her daughter. Ellen hesitated, then finally showed Dorothy the pendant, explaining where she had found it and the thoughts that had been circling in her mind ever since. Her mother studied the pendant carefully, then looked up at Ellen with tired but steady eyes. Dorothy did not tell her what to do. Instead, she asked a simple question. She asked Ellen how she would feel, years from now, looking back at this moment, if she chose one path over the other. Would she remember it with peace, or would it sit uneasily in her heart, no matter how much comfort the money brought? Ellen sat quietly, turning the question over just as she had turned over the pendant the night before. That night, sleep came slowly again. Ellen thought about the letter from her landlord, still waiting to be answered, and the medicine her mother needed, and the fear of losing the roof over their heads. But she also thought about the quiet voice, the one that had never once led her wrong, even when following it had cost her comfort in the past. She thought about the kind of woman she wanted to be, and the kind of example she wanted to set, even if no one else ever knew what she had chosen. By the time morning came again, something inside her had settled, though the fear had not entirely disappeared. She decided she would not sell the pendant, not yet, not without first trying to find out who it truly belonged to. It felt like a small, fragile decision, one that could be undone at any moment if things became desperate enough. But it was a decision nonetheless, and it gave her a strange, quiet sense of steadiness she had not expected. She began her search carefully, first asking a few trusted neighbors if they had heard anyone mention losing a piece of jewelry near the stone bridge. Most shook their heads, though one elderly man named Walter Higgins, who spent his mornings feeding pigeons near the bridge, said he thought he remembered a car stopping there briefly a few days earlier, though he could not recall any details beyond that. It was not much, but it was something. Ellen also stopped by a few of the shops near the bridge, asking quietly if anyone had come in looking for a lost pendant. Most shopkeepers had heard nothing, though a few gave her curious looks, clearly wondering why she was trying so hard to return something she could easily have kept for herself. One woman, running a small flower stall, told her plainly that she was being foolish, that finders were rarely losers in matters like this, and that she should simply keep quiet and enjoy her good fortune. Despite these comments, Ellen continued asking around over the following days, carrying the pendant, carefully wrapped in a small cloth inside her coat pocket wherever she went. She felt a strange mixture of pride and foolishness each time she brought up the subject, unsure whether she was doing the right thing or simply making her own life more difficult than it already was. Meanwhile, the pressure at home continued to build. Her landlord sent another notice, shorter and more direct than the first, warning that failure to pay by the end of the following week would result in eviction. Ellen read the notice standing in the hallway, her stomach twisting into a tight knot, and for a brief, painful moment, she considered abandoning her search entirely and selling the pendant the very next morning. She sat with her mother that evening, the new notice resting on the table between them, and admitted how frightened she had become. Dorothy reached across and took her daughter's hand, her grip weaker than it used to be, but still warm and reassuring. She told Ellen that fear was a normal companion in difficult moments, but that it should never be allowed to make the final decision on its own. That night, unable to sleep once again, Ellen sat by the window, looking out at the quiet street below, the pendant resting in her lap. She thought about all the people who had told her to keep it, to sell it, to stop wasting time on a search that might lead nowhere. She thought about how easy it would be to agree with them, to end the uncertainty, to solve her problems in one quick and simple stroke. But she also thought about her mother's steady eyes, and the quiet voice that had never once steered her wrong, and the strange, small peace she had felt the moment she decided to search for the pendant's true owner, rather than sell it. She realized that peace was worth more to her than she had first understood, even in the middle of such real and pressing fear. The following morning, she resolved to widen her search, visiting the small local newspaper office to ask if anyone had placed a notice about a lost item. The clerk there, a patient young man, checked through recent submissions and found nothing matching her description, but he suggested she try asking around the wealthier part of town, near the old manor houses, since pendants of that quality rarely belonged to ordinary townsfolk. Ellen thanked him and stepped back out into the street, feeling a small flicker of hope for the first time in days. The wealthier part of town was a place she rarely visited, a quiet row of grand old houses set back from the road behind iron gates and tall hedges. She had heard stories about the families who lived there, some kind, some distant, some almost frightening in their reputation for suspicion and mistrust. As she walked slowly along the gated road, studying each house in turn, she felt a nervous flutter in her stomach, uncertain of what she would say if anyone actually answered her questions. She reminded herself that she was only trying to do the right thing, regardless of how the outcome unfolded, and that thought alone gave her enough courage to knock on the first heavy wooden door she came to. An older housekeeper answered, eyeing Ellen's simple clothing with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Ellen explained politely why she had come, showing a small sketch she had made of the pendant rather than the item itself, unwilling to reveal something so valuable to a stranger on a doorstep. The housekeeper shook her head, saying nothing had been reported missing in that particular household, but suggested Ellen try further down the road, near the largest house at the very end. Ellen thanked her and continued walking, the afternoon light beginning to fade behind the tall trees lining the road. Her feet ached, and her earlier flicker of hope had begun to dim slightly, replaced once again by the familiar weight of uncertainty. Still, she pressed on, telling herself that she had come this far, and turning back now would only leave her with more unanswered questions than before. As she approached the final house, a large stone building, with tall windows and a heavy iron gate standing slightly ajar, she noticed a strange stillness in the air, as though the entire property had been waiting quietly for her arrival. She paused at the gate, gathering her courage, unaware that the next few moments would set into motion events far larger and stranger than she could possibly have imagined. Ellen pushed the iron gate open slowly, the metal creaking against the quiet evening air, and stepped onto a gravel path that led toward the large stone house ahead. The windows were dark, except for a single light glowing faintly on the ground floor, and the entire property felt strangely still, as though it had been waiting for someone to arrive for a very long time. She hesitated at the edge of the path, suddenly unsure whether knocking on such an imposing door was wise. Before she could decide, a voice called out from the side of the house, sharp and suspicious. An older woman stepped out from behind a tall hedge, dressed in a dark coat despite the mild evening, her silver hair pulled back tightly. She demanded to know who Ellen was, and why she had entered the property uninvited. Her tone was cold, guarded, the voice of someone who had learned through hard experience not to trust strangers easily. Ellen apologized quickly, explaining that she had been asking around the area about a lost item, a gold pendant she had found near the stone bridge several days earlier. She showed the small sketch she had drawn, careful once again not to reveal the actual pendant to someone she did not yet know or trust. The older woman's expression shifted the moment she saw the drawing, her sharp eyes narrowing, studying every line Ellen had sketched. For a long, tense moment, neither of them spoke. Then the woman asked Ellen to describe the pendant in greater detail, her voice slightly less harsh than before, though still guarded. Ellen described the teardrop shape, the small red stone at its center, the delicate gold chain loop, where a necklace had clearly once been attached. As she spoke, she noticed the older woman's hands tighten around the edge of her coat. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Ashby, owner of the house and the surrounding land. She explained, slowly and carefully, that the pendant Ellen described sounded remarkably similar to one that had belonged to her late husband's family for generations, passed down through several generations before eventually coming to her. She had noticed it missing only a few days earlier, but had said nothing publicly, unwilling to reveal such a loss to anyone she did not fully trust. Margaret's caution did not fade easily. even after hearing Ellen's honest account. She asked pointed questions, testing whether Ellen's story remained consistent, whether she seemed to be searching for a reward rather than genuinely trying to return something that was not hers. Ellen answered each question patiently, feeling a strange mixture of nervousness and quiet determination, unwilling to let suspicion discourage her from finishing what she had set out to do. After several minutes of careful questioning, Margaret finally asked Ellen if she still had the pendant with her, or whether she had already sold it elsewhere. Ellen reached into her coat pocket, retrieved the small cloth bundle she had carried for days, and carefully unwrapped it, revealing the gold pendant resting in her palm. Margaret's breath caught sharply, and for a moment, her guarded expression cracked into something closer to disbelief. She reached out slowly, almost hesitantly, as though afraid the pendant might disappear the moment she touched it. Ellen placed it gently into her open palm, watching as Margaret turned it over carefully, examining every familiar detail. The small scratch near the clasp, the particular shade of red in the stone, details only someone who had owned it for years would recognize immediately. It was, without question, the very pendant she had lost. Margaret looked up at Ellen, her sharp eyes now filled with something closer to confusion than suspicion. She asked, almost quietly, why Ellen had gone through so much trouble to return something so valuable, especially when she could easily have sold it and told no one. Ellen explained honestly about her financial struggles, her mother's illness, and the temptation she had faced, admitting openly how difficult the decision had truly been. She explained that despite everything, she could not bring herself to keep something that was not rightfully hers, no matter how desperately she needed the money it represented. She told Margaret about the quiet voice she had listened to, the one that reminded her of the kind of person she wanted to remain, regardless of how much easier the opposite choice might have seemed in the moment. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression slowly softening as Ellen spoke, though she said very little in response. When Ellen finished, Margaret simply nodded, thanked her formally, and said she needed time to consider everything that had just happened. She did not offer any reward, nor did she invite Ellen inside, and after a brief, somewhat awkward silence, Ellen turned and made her way back down the gravel path toward the gate. Walking home that evening, Ellen felt an unusual mixture of emotions swirling inside her. Part of her felt lighter, relieved that the pendant was finally back with its rightful owner, no longer weighing on her conscience. Yet another part of her felt strangely empty, aware that her financial troubles remained exactly as difficult as they had been before, the eviction notice still waiting on her kitchen table, unresolved and pressing. When she arrived home, her mother asked immediately how things had gone, and Ellen recounted the entire encounter in careful detail, describing Margaret's suspicion, her sharp questions, and the quiet, uncertain way the conversation had ended. Dorothy listened closely, her tired eyes shining with quiet pride, though she too recognized that their practical problems had not been solved by this act of honesty. That night, Ellen lay awake once again, staring at the ceiling, wondering whether she had made the right choice after all. She reminded herself gently that the decision had never truly been about receiving something in return, but she could not entirely ignore the small human part of her that wished circumstances might somehow improve because of what she had done. Still, sleep eventually came, heavier and more peaceful than it had been in many nights. The following days passed slowly, filled with the same routines as before. Ellen continued working at the school, caring for her mother in the evenings, and quietly worrying about the approaching deadline from her landlord. She heard nothing further from Margaret Ashby, and slowly began to assume that their brief encounter had truly reached its end, a small, private moment of honesty that would fade quietly into memory. Word of what had happened, however, began to spread slowly through the town, as such stories often do in small communities. Neighbors who had heard about Ellen's search for the pendant's owner now heard the rest of the tale, and opinions varied sharply. Some praised her honesty, calling her an example of rare and admirable character, while others, including Charlotte from the school staff room, shook their heads at what they considered a wasted opportunity. Ellen tried her best to ignore both the praise and the criticism, focusing instead on the practical matters pressing down on her daily life. She began searching for extra work in the evenings, hoping to earn enough additional money to satisfy her landlord before the final deadline arrived. She took in mending from neighbors, cleaned a few extra houses on weekends, and stretched every coin as far as it could possibly go. Despite her efforts, the numbers still did not fully add up, and as the final days before the deadline approached, Ellen felt the familiar tightness of fear settling once again in her chest. She tried not to let her mother see how worried she had become, forcing calm smiles during their evening conversations, though Dorothy's careful eyes rarely missed the tension hidden just beneath the surface. One evening, as Ellen returned home exhausted from an extra cleaning job, she found an unfamiliar envelope waiting on the small table near the front door, left there by her landlady who occasionally collected mail on her behalf. The envelope bore no return address, only her name, written in neat, careful handwriting. Curious and slightly nervous, she opened it carefully, unsure what to expect. Inside was a short, formally written note from Margaret Ashby, requesting that Ellen visit her home again, at her earliest convenience, without explaining further details in the letter itself. Ellen read the note several times, searching for any hint of its purpose, but found nothing beyond the polite, brief request. She felt a strange flutter of nervous anticipation, unsure whether this visit would bring good news or simply another uncomfortable conversation. She discussed the letter with her mother that evening, both of them speculating quietly about what Margaret might want. Dorothy suggested gently that perhaps the older woman simply wished to express proper thanks in person, having had time to reflect on the honesty she had witnessed. Ellen nodded, though privately she found it difficult to imagine the guarded, suspicious woman she had met suddenly becoming warm or grateful. The following afternoon, after finishing her shift at the school, Ellen made her way once again toward the quiet, gated road at the edge of town, her heart beating a little faster with each step. The gravel path leading to Margaret's house felt somehow less intimidating this time, though her nervousness remained, curious thoughts circling through her mind about what awaited her at the end of it. This time, when she reached the gate, a young housemaid greeted her politely and led her directly inside, through a wide entrance hall lined with old portraits and polished wooden furniture. Ellen glanced around quietly, feeling distinctly out of place amid such quiet, careful wealth, though she reminded herself firmly not to let her nervousness show too openly. She was led into a small sitting room, where Margaret Ashby sat waiting near a tall window, the gold pendant resting on a small table beside her chair. Margaret gestured for Ellen to sit, her expression far less guarded than during their previous meeting, though still composed and difficult to fully read. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet ticking of a nearby clock filling the space between them. Finally, Margaret began speaking, her voice steady and deliberate. She explained that she had spent several days considering everything that had happened, turning the entire situation over carefully in her mind, much the way she suspected Ellen herself had turned the pendant over in her own hands during those difficult nights of temptation. She admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that she rarely trusted people easily, having been deceived more than once, in matters involving money and inheritance. She explained that the pendant Ellen had found held far greater significance than its material value alone. It had belonged to her husband's grandmother, and beyond its sentimental worth, it also served as a private test she had quietly devised months earlier, though she stopped short of explaining precisely what she meant by that, leaving Ellen curious and slightly confused by the mysterious phrasing. Margaret continued, saying that in recent years she had grown increasingly concerned about the future of her estate and business affairs, having no children of her own, and few relatives she felt she could genuinely trust. She admitted, quietly, that she had begun searching, in her own careful way, for someone of proven honesty and character, someone she might eventually consider bringing into her confidence regarding matters far beyond a simple lost pendant. Ellen listened closely, unsure exactly where this conversation was heading, though a faint, cautious sense of anticipation began stirring somewhere deep inside her. She remained quiet, allowing Margaret to continue at her own careful pace, sensing that whatever the older woman was building toward required patience rather than interruption. Margaret paused, studying Ellen closely for a long moment, before finally asking a question that caught Ellen completely off guard. She asked whether Ellen might be willing to consider a position within her household, one involving greater responsibility than simple domestic work, hinting at duties connected to the management of her estate and personal affairs, though she remained deliberately vague about the full details for the time being. Ellen sat in stunned silence for several seconds, uncertain whether she had understood the offer correctly. She had arrived expecting perhaps a simple word of thanks, or at most a small token of gratitude, never imagining that returning the pendant might lead toward something as significant as steady, meaningful employment within such a substantial household. Her mind raced quickly toward thoughts of her mother, her unpaid rent, and the uncertain future they had been facing together. Before she could form a proper response, Margaret raised a hand gently, asking her not to answer immediately. She explained that such a decision deserved careful thought, not a hurried response given in a moment of surprise, and suggested that Ellen take a few days to consider everything discussed, promising to explain further details once Ellen had made up her mind. With that, the conversation ended for the day, though Ellen's thoughts remained far from settled as she made her way back home through the quiet evening streets. For the next 3 days, Ellen carried Margaret's words with her everywhere she went, turning them over in her mind, the same way she once turned over the gold pendant itself. She scrubbed floors at the school with her thoughts far away, folded laundry at home while barely noticing what her hands were doing, and lay awake each night, trying to imagine what a life working closely with someone like Margaret Ashby might actually look like. Her mother watched her closely during those days, noticing the distracted look in her daughter's eyes, the way she sometimes stopped mid-sentence, lost in thought. One evening, as they sat together after a simple dinner, Dorothy finally asked directly what was troubling her so deeply, gently reminding Ellen that carrying worries alone rarely made them lighter. Ellen explained everything Margaret had said, the vague mention of estate matters, the mysterious hints about trust and responsibility, and the strange feeling that something far larger than a simple job offer was being quietly arranged. Dorothy listened patiently, then asked the same kind of steady question she often asked, wondering aloud what Ellen's own heart was telling her to do, beneath all the noise of fear and uncertainty. Ellen admitted that a part of her felt drawn toward accepting the offer, curious about the opportunity, and grateful for the possibility of steady income, yet another part of her felt cautious, wondering whether Margaret's world of wealth and old family history held complications she could not yet fully understand. She worried about leaving her familiar, simple work at the school for something so unfamiliar and unpredictable. Despite her uncertainty, the practical pressures of daily life continued pressing down on her without pause. The final deadline from her landlord arrived 2 days later, and despite her best efforts at extra work, she remained short of the full amount owed. She stood in the small kitchen that morning, counting coins for the 3rd time, hoping somehow the total might change, though of course it never did. Later that same day, her landlord arrived in person, his expression tight and unsympathetic, informing her plainly that unless full payment arrived by the following morning, she and her mother would need to vacate the flat within the week. Ellen tried to explain her situation, promising the remaining amount soon, but he simply shook his head, unwilling to extend any further patience after so many delays. That evening, sitting beside her mother, Ellen felt fear settle over her more heavily than it had in weeks. She thought again of Margaret's offer, wondering whether accepting it quickly might provide the security she so desperately needed. Yet she also worried about appearing desperate or motivated purely by money rather than genuine character, especially after everything she had already gone through to prove her honesty. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Ellen decided early the next morning to return once again to Margaret's home, hoping to speak with her directly, rather than waiting passively for further instructions. She walked briskly through the quiet streets, her mind rehearsing different ways of explaining her situation honestly, without appearing to beg or manipulate the older woman's earlier kindness. When she arrived at the gate, the same young housemaid greeted her, though this time with a small, knowing smile, as though she had been expecting Ellen's return sooner rather than later. She led Ellen once again to the small sitting room, where Margaret sat waiting, appearing far less surprised by the unannounced visit than Ellen had feared she might be. Ellen explained everything honestly, describing the landlord's final deadline, the fear of losing her home, and her uncertainty about the vague estate position Margaret had mentioned days earlier. She admitted openly that she needed steady work soon, but insisted firmly that she had not returned simply to pressure Margaret into a hurried decision, only to understand more clearly what accepting the position might actually involve. Margaret listened carefully, her expression thoughtful rather than suspicious this time, and finally began explaining the details Ellen had been waiting anxiously to hear. She described a modest but steady salary, considerably higher than Ellen currently earned, along with lodging available within a small cottage located on the edge of the estate grounds, intended for staff who worked closely with household affairs. She explained further that the role would involve assisting with correspondence, record-keeping, and eventually learning more about the management of certain business matters connected to the estate. work that required someone patient, careful, and above all, trustworthy. Margaret admitted candidly that she had tested several people informally over recent months, though none had responded with the same quiet integrity Ellen had shown regarding the pendant. Ellen felt a flood of relief wash over her as she listened, though she remained careful not to let her emotions overwhelm the seriousness of the moment. She asked several practical questions about her mother's ability to live with her in the cottage, about the stability of the arrangement, and about what exactly would be expected of her during the early weeks of adjusting to such unfamiliar responsibilities. Margaret answered each question directly, confirming that her mother would be welcome to live in the cottage as well, and that proper arrangements could even be made for a doctor to visit regularly, given Dorothy's ongoing health concerns. This assurance affected Ellen deeply, touching a part of her heart that had worried constantly about her mother's care, far more than her own comfort. After several more minutes of careful discussion, Ellen finally accepted the position, her voice steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. Margaret nodded with quiet satisfaction, though her expression remained composed rather than openly warm, as though she too were still adjusting to the idea of trusting someone so completely after years of guarded caution. Before Ellen left that day, Margaret arranged for immediate assistance regarding the outstanding rent, instructing her housekeeper to accompany Ellen to speak directly with her landlord, ensuring the debt would be settled properly and swiftly. Ellen felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, though she also insisted, somewhat firmly, that she intended to earn her keep honestly, rather than accept charity she had not worked for. Margaret seemed pleased by this insistence, remarking quietly that such an attitude only confirmed her earlier judgment about Ellen's character. She explained that the arrangement was not charity at all, but rather an advance against Ellen's future earnings, a distinction Ellen appreciated deeply, as it allowed her to accept the help without feeling as though she had compromised the very honesty that had brought her to this point. That evening, Ellen returned home, to find her mother anxiously waiting by the window, watching for her arrival. She explained everything that had happened, watching her mother's tired face slowly transform, with relief and quiet joy, as the full weight of their circumstances began to lift, for the first time, in many difficult months. Dorothy squeezed her daughter's hand tightly, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. Over the following days, Ellen carefully arranged the details of their move, packing what little they owned into a few worn boxes and bags, saying goodbye to the small, familiar flat that had witnessed so much struggle and worry. Neighbors who had once doubted her decision now offered warm congratulations, while others remained quietly envious, though Ellen tried not to dwell too long on either reaction. The cottage on Margaret's estate proved far more comfortable than Ellen had imagined, a small but sturdy stone building surrounded by neat gardens, with enough space for both her and her mother to live comfortably. Dorothy settled into a bright, sunny room near the window, and within days, her spirits seemed noticeably lifted simply by the change of surroundings and the promise of steadier, easier days ahead. Ellen began her new responsibilities cautiously, learning quickly under Margaret's careful guidance how to organize correspondence, maintain simple financial records, and understand the basic structure of the estate's various dealings. She approached every task with the same quiet diligence she had once applied to sweeping school floors, determined to prove that Margaret's trust had not been placed unwisely. Despite the improved circumstances, Ellen soon began noticing subtle tensions within the household that had not been visible during her earlier brief visits. Certain staff members seemed to watch her with quiet curiosity, whispering occasionally when they assumed she could not hear them, wondering openly why an unknown young woman had suddenly been granted such unusual trust within Margaret's private affairs. One particular figure within the household drew Ellen's attention more than the others, a distant nephew of Margaret's late husband named Edward Ashby, who visited the estate periodically and seemed to regard Ellen's presence with open suspicion, rather than simple curiosity. His polite greetings carried an unmistakable edge of coldness, and Ellen quickly sensed that her arrival had disrupted something within the household's careful balance that ran far deeper than she initially understood. Edward Ashby arrived at the estate almost exactly 1 week after Ellen had settled into her new duties, driving up the gravel path in a polished car that seemed slightly out of place among the quiet, old-fashioned surroundings of Margaret's home. Ellen first noticed him through the study window, watching as he stepped out and greeted the housekeeper with practiced charm, though something about his manner felt carefully rehearsed rather than genuinely warm. She learned later that day, from a brief conversation with the housekeeper, that Edward was the son of Margaret's late husband's younger brother, and that he visited the estate several times a year, always with polite reasons involving family matters or business concerns. The housekeeper mentioned this information carefully, her tone suggesting there was more beneath the surface than she felt comfortable explaining directly. When Ellen finally met Edward properly, during a brief introduction arranged by Margaret herself, she noticed immediately how his eyes studied her closely, assessing rather than simply greeting. He asked several pointed questions about her background, her previous work, and how exactly she had come to earn such quick trust within his aunt's household, his tone polite on the surface, yet unmistakably probing underneath. Ellen answered honestly, explaining briefly about the pendant and the circumstances that had led to her new position, though she noticed Edward's expression tighten slightly as she spoke, as though the story confirmed some suspicion he had already been forming in his mind. He offered a thin smile afterward, remarking that it was certainly an unusual way to gain such rapid access to a family's private affairs. Margaret, standing nearby during this exchange, interjected calmly, reminding Edward that trust within her household remained entirely her own decision to make, regardless of how quickly or unusually it had developed. Edward nodded politely, though Ellen could sense a quiet tension simmering beneath his composed exterior, one that suggested this conversation was far from finished, merely postponed for the moment. Over the following days, Ellen noticed Edward lingering around the estate more frequently than seemed typical, often appearing in rooms shortly after she had been working there, glancing briefly at documents left on the desk, before quickly excusing himself. She said nothing at first, uncertain whether she was imagining suspicion where none truly existed, reminding herself not to judge someone too harshly based on limited interactions. However, her uncertainty faded slightly one afternoon, when she overheard a fragment of conversation between Edward and one of the household staff, discussing in hushed tones how quickly Ellen had managed to gain access to sensitive financial records, and questioning aloud whether Margaret fully understood the risks of trusting a stranger so completely, with matters of significant inheritance and property. Ellen felt a knot form in her stomach upon hearing this, recognizing immediately that Edward viewed her not simply with mild curiosity, but with genuine concern, or perhaps something closer to resentment, regarding her sudden and unexplained rise within the household. She wondered whether he feared she might somehow influence Margaret's decisions regarding the estate's future, particularly concerning matters of inheritance that likely mattered greatly to him personally. That evening, Ellen mentioned her growing unease to her mother, describing Edward's pointed questions and the overheard conversation that had left her feeling unusually watched. Dorothy listened carefully, then reminded her daughter gently that suspicion often grew fastest in situations involving money and family history, and that maintaining honest, careful behavior remained the wisest response, regardless of how others chose to interpret her actions. Determined to continue her work, with the same diligence and honesty that had brought her this opportunity, Ellen focused carefully on every task Margaret assigned her, double-checking figures, organizing correspondence meticulously, and avoiding any appearance of overstepping boundaries that had not yet been clearly explained to her. She hoped that consistent, careful behavior might eventually ease whatever suspicions Edward continued harboring. Despite her efforts, tension within the household continued building slowly over the following weeks. Edward's visits became noticeably more frequent, and Ellen often found herself the subject of quiet, curious glances from various staff members who had clearly heard whispered concerns about her rapid rise within Margaret's confidence. She tried her best to remain focused, though the growing scrutiny weighed increasingly on her mind. One afternoon, while organizing a set of older financial documents at Margaret's request, Ellen discovered several discrepancies within certain account records, small inconsistencies that seemed unusual, given how carefully the rest of the estate's finances appeared to be managed. She hesitated before mentioning her discovery, uncertain whether raising such concerns so early in her employment might appear presumptuous or overstepping. After considering the matter carefully overnight, she decided the following morning to bring the discrepancies quietly to Margaret's attention, choosing her words carefully to avoid sounding accusatory toward anyone in particular. Margaret listened closely as Ellen explained what she had found, her expression growing increasingly serious as she reviewed the documents Ellen had brought along for reference. Margaret thanked her for the careful observation, remarking quietly that such attention to detail confirmed once again why she had chosen to trust Ellen so completely. She asked Ellen to continue reviewing the older records discreetly, without mentioning the matter to anyone else within the household for the time being, explaining that she wished to understand the full situation before deciding how best to proceed. Ellen agreed, though she felt a slight unease settling over her, aware that continuing such an investigation quietly might eventually place her directly at odds with whoever was responsible for the discrepancies she had discovered. She could not yet be certain whether the inconsistencies stemmed from simple bookkeeping errors or something far more deliberate, though a small, uncomfortable suspicion had already begun forming in the back of her mind. Over the following days, Ellen worked carefully through the older financial records whenever she found quiet moments alone in the study, cross-referencing dates, signatures, and figures with meticulous patience. Slowly, a clearer pattern began emerging, one that suggested certain funds had been quietly redirected over an extended period, disguised carefully within legitimate-looking transactions that might easily have gone unnoticed by someone less attentive. She noticed, with growing unease, that several of the suspicious transactions bore initials matching Edward's name, appearing periodically over the past 2 years, in connection with supposed estate maintenance expenses that seemed disproportionately large compared to the actual work described. Her hands trembled slightly as she compiled her findings, aware of the serious implications such evidence might carry for someone within Margaret's own family. Ellen debated carefully how to present her findings, wary of making accusations she could not fully support, yet equally unwilling to remain silent about something so significant, especially after Margaret had placed such deliberate trust in her honesty. She decided finally to compile the evidence clearly and factually, presenting only the documented facts, rather than any personal assumptions about intent or wrongdoing. Before she could arrange a proper meeting with Margaret to share her completed findings, Edward arrived unexpectedly at the estate late one evening, his expression noticeably tense as he requested a private conversation with his aunt. Ellen, working quietly in the adjoining study, could not help overhearing fragments of their raised voices through the partially closed door, though she could not make out the full details of their heated exchange. Later that night, after Edward had departed abruptly, without his usual polite farewells, Margaret called Ellen into the sitting room, her expression unusually troubled. She explained that Edward had somehow learned about Ellen's quiet review of the older financial records and had reacted with unexpected anger, accusing Ellen directly of overstepping her role and attempting to manipulate Margaret against her own family for personal gain. Ellen felt a wave of anxious tension rise within her chest upon hearing this, recognizing immediately that the careful, quiet investigation she had been conducting had suddenly become a far more public and dangerous matter than she had originally anticipated. She realized, with a sinking feeling, that proving her own innocence and honesty might soon become just as important as uncovering whatever truth lay hidden within those troubling financial records. The days following Edward's angry outburst felt heavier than any Ellen had experienced since arriving at the estate. Word of the confrontation spread quietly among the household staff, and though nobody spoke to her directly about it, she noticed the careful, uncertain glances that followed her whenever she moved through the halls, as though everyone was quietly waiting to see how the situation would eventually unfold. Margaret remained composed on the surface, continuing her daily routines with the same steady discipline she always maintained, though Ellen noticed small signs of strain beneath her calm exterior, a slight tightness around her eyes, a longer pause before answering certain questions. It became clear that the accusation against Ellen had troubled Margaret deeply, regardless of how firmly she tried not to show it. 2 days later, Edward returned to the estate, this time accompanied by a solicitor, a thin, serious man named Frederick Doyle, who carried a leather folder filled with documents. Ellen watched nervously from the study window as they walked toward the house, sensing immediately that whatever conversation was about to unfold would carry significant consequences, not only for herself, but for the entire household. Margaret called Ellen into the sitting room shortly after their arrival, asking her to remain present during the discussion, explaining quietly beforehand that transparency mattered more now than ever, and that hiding Ellen away would only strengthen suspicions rather than resolve them. Ellen nodded, steadying her nerves as best she could, before stepping into the room where Edward and the solicitor already sat waiting. Edward began speaking almost immediately, his tone carefully measured, though clearly still frustrated, explaining to Margaret that Ellen's sudden interest in old financial records, so soon after joining the household, appeared deeply suspicious to him. He suggested, without directly accusing her outright, that Ellen might be searching for information to use against the family, or perhaps attempting to create doubt about his own handling of certain estate matters. Margaret listened patiently, then calmly explained that she herself had specifically requested Ellen's assistance in reviewing the older records, following her own personal concerns about certain inconsistencies she had noticed independently over recent months. She stated clearly that Ellen's involvement had been her own decision entirely, not some scheme orchestrated behind her back, and that any suggestion otherwise misunderstood the situation completely. Edward appeared momentarily caught off guard by this clarification, glancing briefly toward his solicitor, before continuing more cautiously. He argued that regardless of who had initiated the review, the discrepancies Ellen claimed to have found were likely simple clerical errors, common enough within any large estate's long history of record-keeping, and hardly worth the serious implications being suggested. Ellen, though nervous, finally spoke up, requesting permission from Margaret to present the specific documents she had carefully compiled. Margaret nodded, and Ellen retrieved a small folder from the desk, laying out the relevant records methodically, pointing calmly to specific dates, figures, and initials that appeared repeatedly in connection with unusually large maintenance expenses over the previous 2 years. Frederick Doyle examined the documents closely, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive, occasionally asking Ellen precise questions about how she had identified each discrepancy. Ellen answered every question directly, explaining her methodical cross-referencing process without exaggeration or unnecessary emotion, simply presenting the factual patterns exactly as she had discovered them during her careful review. Edward grew visibly uncomfortable as the discussion continued, insisting repeatedly that the expenses in question related to legitimate estate maintenance work he had personally overseen, though he struggled to provide specific details when Frederick pressed him for further clarification regarding particular transactions. His earlier confident tone began slipping gradually into something closer to defensive frustration. Margaret watched this exchange closely, her expression revealing little, though Ellen sensed a quiet, careful calculation happening behind her composed features, as though she were weighing every word spoken against years of accumulated knowledge about her nephew's character and history within the family business affairs. The tension in the room grew steadily heavier as the conversation continued. Finally, Frederick suggested calmly that a proper independent audit of the relevant records would settle the matter definitively, removing any doubt about intent or wrongdoing from either side of the disagreement. Margaret agreed immediately, stating that she welcomed such thorough investigation, having nothing to hide regarding her own affairs, and expecting the same transparency from anyone else connected to her family's finances. Edward hesitated visibly before agreeing, his reluctance evident despite his attempt to mask it with continued polite composure. He argued weakly that such an audit seemed unnecessary, given his long history of trusted service to the family, though Margaret reminded him gently but firmly that trust, however long established, did not exempt anyone from proper accountability when legitimate questions had been raised. After Edward and his solicitor departed later that afternoon, Margaret remained quiet for a long while, staring thoughtfully out the tall window of her sitting room. Ellen waited patiently nearby, uncertain whether she should speak or simply allow the older woman space to process everything that had just unfolded. Eventually, Margaret turned toward her, her expression tired but resolute. She thanked Ellen quietly for her calm, factual presentation during the meeting, acknowledging that such composure under pressure had likely prevented the situation from becoming even more contentious than it already was. She admitted, with unusual openness, that she had long suspected something was amiss within certain estate matters, though she had lacked concrete evidence until Ellen's careful review brought the pattern clearly into focus. Margaret explained further that arranging the independent audit would take several weeks, during which time tensions within the household would likely remain uncomfortable, particularly given Edward's clear displeasure about the situation. She warned Ellen gently to remain cautious during this period, aware that Edward might attempt to discredit her further in an effort to protect his own position before the audit could reach its conclusion. That evening, Ellen returned to the cottage feeling emotionally drained, though also strangely steady, aware that she had handled a difficult and unexpected challenge with the same quiet honesty that had guided her decision regarding the pendant many weeks earlier. She explained the day's events to her mother, who listened with quiet concern, reminding Ellen once again that doing what was right rarely came without some measure of difficulty along the way. Over the following days, Ellen noticed subtle changes in how certain household staff members treated her, some offering quiet nods of support, having apparently grown suspicious of Edward's behavior themselves over recent years, while others remained distant and wary, uncertain which side of the unfolding situation might ultimately prove correct. She tried her best to remain focused entirely on her assigned responsibilities, avoiding unnecessary conversations about the ongoing tension. Meanwhile, word arrived that the independent auditors would begin their thorough review within the coming week, examining several years of estate financial records in careful detail. Margaret informed Ellen that she would be expected to assist the auditors directly, given her familiarity with the specific discrepancies already identified, a responsibility Ellen accepted seriously, understanding fully the significance such cooperation carried for the eventual outcome. As the days passed, leading toward the auditor's arrival, an unexpected letter arrived at the cottage, addressed directly to Ellen, written in unfamiliar handwriting, and containing no signature. The message inside was brief but unsettling, warning her vaguely to reconsider her involvement in matters that did not concern her, suggesting that continuing to interfere would bring consequences she would deeply regret. Ellen read the anonymous warning several times, her hands trembling slightly as the implications settled over her. She debated briefly whether to mention the letter to Margaret immediately or wait until morning, eventually deciding that such a threat, however vague, deserved immediate attention, rather than quiet worry, carried alone through another sleepless night. Ellen walked quickly to the main house that evening, the anonymous letter clutched tightly in her hand, her heart beating faster with every step along the familiar gravel path. She found Margaret still awake in the sitting room, reading quietly beside the fire, and without wasting time on lengthy explanations, Ellen handed her the letter directly, watching closely as Margaret's expression shifted from calm curiosity to visible concern. Margaret read the message twice, her jaw tightening slightly, before setting it down carefully on the small table beside her chair. She asked Ellen several careful questions, whether she recognized the handwriting, whether anyone had approached her directly with similar warnings, and whether she felt genuinely frightened or simply unsettled by the vague nature of the threat. Ellen admitted honestly that she felt both, uncertain how seriously to take such an anonymous message. After a long moment of thought, Margaret suggested they involve Frederick Doyle immediately, believing that a legal professional's perspective might help determine how seriously such a threat should be treated, and whether it warranted involving local authorities. Ellen agreed, relieved that Margaret intended to take the matter seriously, rather than dismiss it as mere anxious imagination on her part. The following morning, Frederick arrived promptly, examining the letter carefully before offering his measured opinion. He explained that while the message contained no explicit threat of physical harm, its vague warning combined with the ongoing financial investigation suggested a deliberate attempt at intimidation, likely intended to discourage Ellen from continuing her cooperation with the upcoming audit. He recommended that Ellen document the incident formally, keeping the letter as evidence, and remain alert to any further suspicious occurrences, while also suggesting that additional caution be taken regarding who had access to information about her daily movements and schedule. Margaret agreed immediately, arranging for one of the more trusted groundskeepers to keep a discreet, watchful eye on the cottage during the coming weeks. Despite these precautions, Ellen found it difficult to shake the unease that had settled over her since receiving the letter. She continued her work diligently, assisting the arriving auditors with careful attention, though she remained constantly aware of her surroundings, glancing occasionally toward windows and doorways, with a heightened alertness she had never previously needed within her quiet, ordinary life. The auditors, a pair of methodical, quiet professionals named Gerald and Beatrice, worked steadily through the estate's financial records over the following 2 weeks, cross-referencing every transaction Ellen had previously identified along with numerous additional records spanning several years. Ellen assisted them patiently, answering questions about her own findings and helping locate older documents stored within the estate's extensive archive room. As the audit progressed, a clearer and more troubling picture began emerging. The discrepancies Ellen had originally noticed represented only a small portion of a much larger pattern, one suggesting that funds had been systematically redirected over nearly 3 years, disguised carefully, within seemingly legitimate maintenance and management expenses, connected directly to accounts under Edward's personal oversight. Margaret received regular updates from Gerald and Beatrice throughout this period, her expression growing increasingly somber as the true scope of the situation became clear. She confided quietly to Ellen one evening that she had genuinely hoped the discrepancies might prove to be simple, innocent mistakes, feeling a deep sadness at the growing likelihood that a member of her own extended family had deliberately deceived her for personal gain. Meanwhile, tensions surrounding the situation continued escalating in unexpected ways. One afternoon, while Ellen walked alone along the quiet road leading toward the small village near the estate, a car slowed unexpectedly beside her, and a stranger she did not recognize leaned out briefly, warning her again in low, deliberate tones to abandon her involvement in matters that were not her concern, before driving away quickly before she could respond or note the vehicle's details clearly. Shaken by this direct encounter, Ellen hurried back toward the estate, informing Margaret and Frederick immediately about what had happened. Frederick's expression grew notably more serious this time, suggesting that such direct intimidation, moving beyond an anonymous letter into a personal confrontation, indicated the situation carried greater risk than initially assumed, and recommended involving local police as a necessary precaution moving forward. Margaret agreed without hesitation, contacting the local authorities that same afternoon to formally report both incidents. A local officer named Sergeant Coleman arrived promptly, taking careful notes about the anonymous letter and the roadside encounter, promising increased patrols near the estate, while the audit investigation continued toward its conclusion. Despite these added precautions, Ellen found herself increasingly anxious during the following days, aware that whoever wished to intimidate her clearly knew details about her daily movements and routines. She began varying her walking routes, staying closer to the main estate grounds whenever possible, and found herself constantly glancing over her shoulder, a habit entirely foreign to the quiet, simple life she had lived before discovering the gold pendant many weeks earlier. Her mother noticed this growing tension immediately, expressing worry about Ellen's safety and gently questioning whether continuing her involvement in such a complicated, potentially dangerous situation truly remained worth the risk. Ellen reassured her mother as calmly as she could, though privately she too wondered occasionally whether stepping back might have been the wiser choice, even as she recognized how deeply she now believed in seeing the truth fully uncovered. One evening, as the audit neared its final stages, Ellen received an unexpected visit from Edward himself, arriving alone at the cottage rather than the main house, his expression noticeably different from the confident composure he had displayed during their earlier confrontations. He appeared tired, almost desperate, asking quietly if he might speak with her privately for a few moments. Ellen hesitated, uncertain whether allowing such a private conversation was wise, given recent events, though something in Edward's uncharacteristically subdued manner convinced her to listen, provided she remained near the open doorway, rather than fully alone with him inside. He began speaking hesitantly, admitting that the financial discrepancies were indeed his doing, though he insisted the funds had been intended only as a temporary measure to address serious personal debts he had never disclosed to his aunt. He explained, with growing emotion, that he had always intended to repay the redirected funds quietly before anyone noticed, believing his family connection entitled him to some leniency should the matter ever come to light. He asked Ellen directly, almost pleadingly, whether she might consider speaking to Margaret on his behalf, suggesting that perhaps a quiet private resolution could still be reached without involving formal legal consequences or permanently damaging his relationship with his aunt. Ellen listened carefully to everything Edward said, feeling a complicated mixture of sympathy and firm resolve settling within her. She explained gently but honestly that the decision regarding forgiveness or consequences belonged entirely to Margaret, not to herself, and that she could not in good conscience attempt to influence such a serious matter based on private pleading, rather than complete, transparent honesty with everyone involved. She told Edward directly that his best course of action would be honesty with Margaret herself, admitting fully what he had done, rather than continuing to seek quiet arrangements that avoided proper accountability. Edward's expression darkened slightly at this response, though he said nothing further, eventually turning and walking away into the darkness, without offering any final words, leaving Ellen standing uncertainly in the cottage doorway, wondering what his next move might be. 2 days after Edward's unexpected visit to the cottage, Margaret received the completed audit report from Gerald and Beatrice, a thick folder containing detailed evidence spanning nearly 3 years of carefully disguised financial transactions. She read through the report slowly that evening, her expression growing heavier with each page, confirming everything Ellen had originally suspected, and far more besides, painting a clear and troubling picture of deliberate deception. The following morning, Margaret called Ellen into her study, the completed report resting on the desk before her. She explained quietly that the evidence left no reasonable doubt regarding Edward's actions, describing specific transactions, dates, and amounts that traced a clear pattern of funds redirected from estate accounts into what appeared to be personal debts and expenses, entirely unrelated to any legitimate estate business. Margaret admitted, with visible sadness, that confronting family dishonesty proved far more painful than she had anticipated, even having suspected something was wrong for quite some time before Ellen's arrival brought the matter into sharper focus. She confided that she had once hoped Edward might eventually take over certain responsibilities within the estate, given the absence of children of her own, though such hopes now felt impossibly complicated by his betrayal of her trust. That same afternoon, without warning, Margaret suffered a sudden collapse while walking through the garden, clutching her chest before falling to the ground near the old stone fountain. A gardener working nearby rushed to her aid, calling loudly for help, and within minutes, Ellen arrived breathlessly, finding Margaret pale and struggling to breathe, her earlier composed dignity replaced entirely by frightening vulnerability. An ambulance was called immediately, and Margaret was rushed to the nearest hospital, where doctors quickly determined she had suffered a serious heart episode, requiring immediate treatment and an extended period of careful monitoring. Ellen accompanied her throughout the frantic journey, holding her hand tightly, trying to offer whatever comfort she could, while fear gripped her own chest just as tightly. The following days passed in an anxious blur, as Ellen divided her time between caring for her own mother back at the cottage and visiting Margaret at the hospital whenever permitted, watching helplessly as monitors beeped steadily beside the older woman's hospital bed. Doctors remained cautiously optimistic, though they warned that Margaret's condition remained serious, requiring complete rest and freedom from unnecessary stress during her recovery. News of Margaret's sudden hospitalization spread quickly, and within 2 days, Edward arrived at the hospital himself, his expression carefully composed despite the obvious tension simmering beneath his controlled demeanor. He requested to speak privately with the attending doctor, then attempted to insert himself into discussions regarding Margaret's care and, more troublingly, her ongoing business affairs, citing his family connection as justification for involvement. Ellen, informed of Edward's presence by a concerned nurse, familiar with the earlier estate tensions, arrived quickly to find him attempting to convince hospital staff that he held authority to make decisions regarding Margaret's affairs during her incapacitation. She intervened calmly but firmly, reminding everyone present that no such authority had been formally granted, and that any decisions regarding Margaret's estate should wait until she herself could participate directly, or until proper legal guidance clarified the situation. Frederick Doyle arrived shortly afterward, having been contacted urgently by Ellen, and confirmed clearly that Edward held no legal authority over Margaret's affairs, particularly given the ongoing investigation into his own financial misconduct. Edward's expression tightened with visible frustration, though he had little choice but to step back, his earlier confident maneuvering thwarted by Ellen's quick, decisive action. Over the following week, Margaret's condition gradually stabilized, and doctors permitted brief, calm visits as her strength slowly returned. During one such visit, while Ellen sat quietly beside her hospital bed, Margaret reached for her hand, her grip weaker than before but still meaningful, and began speaking softly about matters she had apparently been considering carefully during her long hours of forced stillness and reflection. She explained, with unusual openness, that her brush with serious illness had clarified certain decisions she had been hesitant to finalize before. She admitted that the pendant Ellen had returned so many weeks earlier had indeed served as a deliberate test, one she had quietly arranged after growing suspicious of dishonesty within her circle of trusted contacts, hoping to identify someone whose character remained genuinely honest, even when no one was watching. Margaret explained further that she had placed the pendant near the stone bridge deliberately, having observed Ellen's quiet, hard-working reputation within the town for some time, curious whether financial desperation might override basic honesty when temptation arose without any witnesses present. She admitted this method might seem unusual, even manipulative, but insisted it had been born from genuine necessity rather than casual curiosity. Ellen listened with quiet astonishment, realizing fully for the first time that her entire journey, from the initial discovery on the bridge, through every difficult decision that followed, had been carefully observed from its very beginning. She felt a complicated mixture of surprise and understanding, recognizing that Margaret's caution, however unusual its methods, had emerged from genuine and reasonable concern, given her past experiences with deception and betrayal. Margaret continued, explaining that everything Ellen had demonstrated since that initial test, her honesty regarding the financial discrepancies, her composure during Edward's confrontations, and her firm refusal to compromise principles, even when pressured or threatened, had confirmed repeatedly that her initial judgment had been correct. She stated clearly that she intended to formalize Ellen's position within the estate permanently, granting her significantly greater responsibility moving forward. Before Ellen could fully respond to this significant announcement, Margaret raised a frail hand gently, indicating she wished to say something further, something evidently weighing heavily on her mind, even amid her ongoing recovery. She explained that given her health scare and the clear evidence of Edward's betrayal, she had begun reconsidering the entire structure of her estate's future, including decisions regarding inheritance that extended far beyond simple employment matters. She told Ellen candidly that she intended to consult formally with Frederick regarding necessary legal arrangements once she recovered sufficient strength, hinting strongly that these arrangements would involve Ellen far more significantly than either of them had originally anticipated when their strange, unexpected relationship first began, beside a simple gold pendant found upon an ordinary stone bridge many weeks earlier. Ellen left the hospital that evening, feeling emotionally overwhelmed, uncertain how to process everything she had just learned, from the revelation about the deliberate test to the unexpected hints about Margaret's future intentions regarding her estate. She walked home slowly through the quiet evening streets, her mind swirling with questions she knew would require considerable time and patience before finding clear answers. Margaret's recovery continued steadily over the following weeks, though doctors insisted she remain cautious, avoiding unnecessary stress while her heart continued healing. She returned home eventually, settling into a quieter routine than before, spending most afternoons resting in the sitting room, while Ellen managed increasingly significant portions of the estate's daily affairs under her careful, watchful guidance. Meanwhile, the formal consequences of Edward's financial misconduct began moving forward through proper legal channels. Frederick Doyle arranged several meetings with Margaret to discuss how best to proceed, presenting various options ranging from quiet family resolution involving repayment and reduced future involvement, to formal legal prosecution that would carry far more serious and public consequences for Edward. Margaret struggled visibly with this decision, torn between her natural inclination toward family loyalty and her clear recognition that Edward's actions represented a serious betrayal of trust that could not simply be overlooked without consequence. She discussed the matter openly with Ellen on several occasions, valuing her perspective despite the relatively short time they had known one another, given how thoroughly Ellen's honesty had already proven itself under significant pressure. During one such conversation, Ellen offered her honest opinion carefully, suggesting that whatever decision Margaret ultimately reached, it should prioritize preventing further harm rather than simple punishment alone. She reminded Margaret gently that Edward's own words during their private conversation at the cottage suggested genuine remorse, even if his methods of seeking forgiveness had been flawed and self-serving, rather than fully honest. Margaret considered this perspective thoughtfully, eventually deciding upon a middle path that balanced accountability with a measure of compassion. She arranged, through Frederick, for Edward to repay the full redirected amount over a structured period, while formally removing him from any future involvement in estate management or financial oversight, effectively ending his access to family business affairs permanently without pursuing criminal prosecution. Edward accepted these terms quietly when presented with them, his earlier confidence entirely deflated, replaced by a subdued acknowledgement of the consequences his actions had brought upon himself. He did not contest the arrangement, nor did he attempt any further intimidation or interference, seemingly recognizing that his previous attempts at manipulation had only worsened his position rather than improving it in any meaningful way. With this significant matter finally resolved, a noticeable calm settled over the estate for the first time in many weeks. Ellen found herself able to focus more fully on her actual responsibilities without the constant undercurrent of tension and suspicion that had colored her earlier months within the household. She continued learning steadily under Margaret's patient instruction, gradually understanding the full scope of the estate's various business interests and property holdings. Margaret began involving Ellen more deeply in decisions regarding tenant agreements, charitable contributions the estate regularly made within the local community, and long-term planning regarding property maintenance and investment. Ellen approached each new responsibility with the same careful diligence she had always shown, asking thoughtful questions and seeking clarification whenever uncertain, rather than pretending confidence she had not yet genuinely earned. During this period, Ellen's mother Dorothy also continued improving steadily, benefiting greatly from the regular medical care Margaret had arranged, along with the comfortable, stress-free environment of the cottage, compared to their previous cramped and uncertain living situation. Her color returned, her strength gradually increased, and she began taking short walks in the estate gardens most mornings, something she had not managed in over a year. One quiet evening, as Ellen sat with Margaret reviewing some routine correspondence, the older woman set aside her papers and looked at Ellen directly, her expression thoughtful and unusually gentle. She explained that she had spent considerable time recently reflecting on her own mortality, particularly following her recent health scare, and had begun seriously considering questions about legacy and inheritance that she had long avoided addressing directly. She admitted candidly that having no children of her own, and now having formally severed Edward's position within her affairs, she found herself facing genuine uncertainty about who might eventually inherit responsibility for the estate she had spent decades building and protecting. She confided that this uncertainty had troubled her greatly during her recovery, weighing heavily on thoughts she found difficult to discuss, even with someone as trusted as Ellen had become. Ellen listened carefully, uncertain exactly where this conversation was leading, though she sensed correctly that something significant was building toward an important decision Margaret had clearly been considering for some time. She remained quiet, allowing the older woman space to continue at her own careful pace, respecting the weight and seriousness evident in her thoughtful expression. Margaret continued, explaining that over recent months, watching Ellen navigate difficult circumstances with consistent honesty, courage, and genuine care for others, she had gradually arrived at a conclusion she had not anticipated when their unusual relationship first began, beside that simple gold pendant. She stated plainly that she intended to name Ellen as her primary heir, granting her eventual full ownership and responsibility for the estate and its associated business interests. Ellen sat in stunned silence, struggling to process the magnitude of what Margaret had just proposed. She had expected, at most, continued steady employment, and perhaps growing responsibility within the household, never imagining that her simple act of honesty regarding a found pendant might eventually lead toward inheriting an entire estate and its accompanying legacy of responsibility and history. She attempted to express her overwhelming gratitude, though Margaret gently interrupted, explaining that gratitude, while appreciated, was not truly the point of her decision. She stated firmly that she had searched for years for someone demonstrating genuine, consistent integrity, someone who would protect and manage the estate's legacy with the same careful honesty Ellen had shown from their very first encounter, and that Ellen had earned this trust entirely through her own consistent character rather than through any favor or charity. Margaret explained that formal legal arrangements would take time to complete properly, involving Frederick's careful guidance to ensure everything remained legally sound and appropriately documented. She asked Ellen to continue learning about the estate's affairs, with even greater dedication moving forward, preparing gradually for responsibilities that would eventually become entirely her own, rather than simply assisting under Margaret's continued guidance and oversight. That night, walking back to the cottage beneath a clear, star-filled sky, Ellen felt an overwhelming mixture of emotions swirling within her: gratitude, disbelief, and a quiet, humbling awareness of just how far her circumstances had transformed since that ordinary evening on the stone bridge many months earlier. She thought about her mother, now resting comfortably and healthier than she had been in years, and felt tears gathering quietly in her eyes as she considered the strange, remarkable path that had led them both to this unexpected moment. In the weeks that followed Margaret's remarkable announcement, Ellen found herself immersed in an entirely new level of responsibility, learning the deeper details of the estate's various holdings, from tenant farms scattered across the surrounding countryside to a small but steady investment portfolio Margaret had carefully built over many decades. Frederick Doyle visited frequently, explaining legal terminology patiently, and helping Ellen understand documents that had once seemed impossibly complex and unfamiliar. Margaret remained closely involved throughout this process, though her health required her to pace herself carefully, resting often between longer teaching sessions with Ellen. She seemed to genuinely enjoy these afternoons together, sharing not only practical knowledge about estate management, but also stories from her own younger years, memories of her late husband, and reflections on decisions she had made throughout her long life, both wise and regrettable. Ellen listened eagerly to these stories, recognizing that Margaret was passing along far more than simple business knowledge. She was sharing an entire lifetime of accumulated wisdom, hoping Ellen might carry forward not only the practical management of the estate, but also the values and careful judgment that had guided Margaret's own stewardship over so many years. During this period, news of Ellen's remarkable rise continued spreading through the local community, generating considerable curiosity and varied reactions among those who had known her simply as a hard-working cleaner, struggling to support her ailing mother. Some neighbors expressed genuine happiness for her unexpected good fortune, while others, including Charlotte from her previous school position, seemed almost embarrassed by their earlier dismissive comments regarding her decision to return the pendant. Ellen handled this attention with the same quiet humility she had shown throughout her entire journey, neither seeking praise for her honesty, nor allowing the growing recognition to change her fundamental character. She continued visiting old neighbors and friends whenever her schedule permitted, unwilling to let her new circumstances create distance between herself and the community that had shaped her throughout her earlier, more difficult years. One afternoon, while reviewing tenant agreements together, Margaret mentioned quietly that she had also arranged for the local church, the very one Ellen had attended throughout her childhood, to receive a modest increase in charitable support from the estate moving forward, explaining that she believed strongly in continuing to strengthen the community that had raised someone of such genuine character. Ellen felt deeply moved by this gesture, recognizing the thoughtful connection Margaret had drawn between faith, community, and honest character. As formal legal arrangements regarding Ellen's inheritance progressed steadily under Frederick's careful guidance, occasional complications arose, requiring patience and careful navigation. Distant relatives, having heard about Margaret's decision, occasionally sent inquiries or veiled objections, questioning why someone outside the family bloodline had been chosen over more traditional considerations of inheritance and lineage. Margaret addressed each such inquiry directly and firmly, explaining clearly that her decision rested entirely on demonstrated character, rather than family connection alone, reminding anyone who questioned her judgment that blood relation had already proven insufficient protection against dishonesty, as Edward's own actions had painfully demonstrated. Her firm, unwavering responses gradually discouraged further objections from those hoping to challenge her decision. Throughout this period, Ellen's mother Dorothy continued flourishing in her improved circumstances, her health steadily strengthening under consistent medical care and the peaceful, comfortable environment of the estate cottage. She began assisting occasionally with small tasks around the main house, insisting she remain useful despite her improved condition, forming a warm and genuine friendship with Margaret that developed naturally from their shared concern and affection for Ellen. Watching her mother and Margaret develop this unexpected friendship brought Ellen immense quiet joy, recognizing how completely their circumstances had transformed from the desperate uncertainty of those early days facing eviction and worry. She often reflected privately on how differently everything might have unfolded had she succumbed to temptation that first evening on the stone bridge, selling the pendant quickly rather than following the quiet voice urging her toward honesty, despite the personal cost involved. As months passed, the formal legal transition regarding Ellen's future inheritance neared completion, with Frederick finalizing the necessary documentation that would eventually transfer full responsibility for the estate into Ellen's care whenever Margaret felt the time was appropriate, whether through her own choice during her remaining years or eventually following her passing. Margaret insisted on handling this transition gradually and thoughtfully, unwilling to rush such significant responsibility before Ellen felt genuinely prepared. During this same period, Ellen began taking on greater public responsibilities connected to the estate, representing Margaret at certain community events and local business meetings that Margaret herself no longer felt strong enough to attend personally. Ellen approached these new public duties with characteristic careful preparation, always remembering the values of honesty and genuine care that had brought her to this position in the first place. One particular afternoon, while attending a community meeting regarding local charitable initiatives, Ellen encountered Walter Higgins, the elderly man who had first mentioned noticing a car near the stone bridge many months earlier, providing the small clue that eventually helped her identify Margaret as the pendant's rightful owner. He greeted her warmly, expressing genuine pride in how far she had come since that ordinary conversation near the pigeons he fed each morning. Ellen thanked him sincerely, acknowledging that his small piece of information had proven far more significant than either of them could have imagined at the time. Their brief conversation reminded her powerfully of how interconnected every small decision and interaction had been throughout her entire journey. From that first moment of temptation beside the bridge, through every difficult challenge that followed in the months afterward. As the formal transition of responsibility continued progressing steadily, Margaret called Ellen into her study one quiet evening, explaining that she wished to finalize one additional matter before considering the legal arrangements truly complete. She revealed that she intended to establish a small memorial fund within the estate, dedicated specifically toward helping local families facing financial hardship similar to what Ellen and her mother had once experienced, ensuring that others might receive support during their own difficult seasons. Ellen felt deeply touched by this thoughtful addition, recognizing how meaningfully it reflected the entire journey they had shared together, transforming a private test of character into a lasting source of genuine help for others within the community. She expressed her heartfelt gratitude, promising to continue and expand this charitable initiative faithfully, once full responsibility for the estate eventually passed into her own hands. That evening, walking home beneath the familiar stars above the estate grounds, Ellen found herself reflecting quietly on the remarkable transformation her life had undergone since that ordinary evening many months earlier, when she first noticed a small glint of gold hidden between the stones of an old bridge. She realized, with quiet gratitude, that the quiet voice she had chosen to trust during that difficult moment of temptation had guided her toward a life she could never have imagined possible. Nearly a year had passed since Ellen first knelt beside the old stone bridge, brushing fallen leaves away from a small glint of gold that would eventually reshape her entire life. As autumn settled once again over the town of Ashcombe, the estate grounds carried a quiet, settled peace that stood in stark contrast to the uncertainty and tension that had marked so much of the previous months. Margaret's health had stabilized considerably, though she moved more slowly now, relying increasingly on Ellen to manage the daily operations of the estate, while she focused her remaining energy on the matters that brought her the greatest joy, namely, mentoring Ellen further and spending peaceful afternoons in the garden, alongside Dorothy, whose own health continued flourishing under continued careful care. The formal legal transition had been completed several weeks earlier, with Frederick Doyle finalizing all necessary documentation, confirming Ellen's position as Margaret's designated heir and increasingly active manager of the estate's various affairs. Ellen had approached each new responsibility with the same careful diligence that had defined her character from the very beginning, never allowing her growing authority to diminish the humility and honesty that had brought her to this remarkable position. The charitable fund Margaret had established continued growing steadily, already having helped several local families facing situations similar to what Ellen and her mother had once endured. Ellen personally reviewed each request for assistance, remembering vividly what it felt like to face desperate financial uncertainty, and ensuring that every family received not only practical help, but also genuine compassion and understanding during their difficult circumstances. Edward, having completed the agreed repayment of the redirected funds, had settled into a quieter, more distant relationship with the family, occasionally sending polite but brief correspondence, having apparently learned genuine humility from the consequences of his earlier dishonesty. Margaret maintained cordial but carefully guarded contact with him, extending forgiveness without fully restoring the trust that had once defined their family relationship before his betrayal came to light. One particular afternoon, as golden autumn light filtered gently through the tall windows of the estate's sitting room, Margaret called Ellen and Dorothy together for what she described simply as an important conversation. Both women arrived curious, though neither anticipated the depth of reflection Margaret intended to share with them during what would become an especially meaningful afternoon among the three of them. Margaret began by expressing her deep gratitude for the unexpected friendship and trust that had developed between them over the past year, acknowledging openly how dramatically her own life had changed since that initial cautious meeting at her gate, when Ellen first arrived carrying nothing more than a small sketch of a lost pendant. She admitted that she had entered that encounter guarded and suspicious, expecting disappointment, as she so often had throughout her later years. She explained that Ellen's consistent honesty, demonstrated repeatedly through increasingly difficult circumstances, had restored something within her that she had believed permanently lost, following years of disappointment and betrayal from those she should have been able to trust completely. She stated warmly that she now considered both Ellen and Dorothy as genuine family, regardless of the absence of blood relation that some distant relatives had once questioned so pointedly. Dorothy, visibly moved by these words, expressed her own heartfelt gratitude for the remarkable kindness and opportunity Margaret had extended toward her daughter, acknowledging quietly how frightened and uncertain their future had once seemed during those difficult months of illness and financial struggle. She reflected that she had always believed her daughter's honest character would eventually be recognized, though she admitted she had never imagined such recognition arriving in such an extraordinary and life-changing form. Ellen listened to both women speak, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude and quiet peace settle over her, recognizing fully how far her life had traveled from that ordinary evening of fear and temptation beside the stone bridge. She thought about the difficult choices she had faced throughout the past year, the suspicion, the threats, the uncertainty, and the fear, and realized that every difficult moment had ultimately led toward this deep, unexpected sense of belonging and purpose. She spoke quietly, thanking Margaret not only for the material opportunities she had received, but more importantly for the trust and belief Margaret had shown in her character from the very beginning, even during moments when suspicion and doubt might have seemed far easier choices. She acknowledged that her decision to return the pendant had never been made with any expectation of reward, yet she felt profound gratitude that her simple act of honesty had led toward such meaningful and lasting change. Margaret nodded thoughtfully, then shared one final reflection that would remain with Ellen for the rest of her life. She explained that true character reveals itself most clearly in quiet, unseen moments, when no one is watching and no reward seems likely, and that such moments, however small they might initially appear, often carry consequences far greater than anyone could possibly imagine at the time they occur. She reminded Ellen gently that faithfulness in small, hidden matters often becomes the very foundation upon which much larger responsibilities and blessings eventually rest, a lesson she herself had learned slowly throughout her own long life, and one she now felt privileged to have witnessed so clearly demonstrated through Ellen's own remarkable journey over the past year. As the golden autumn afternoon gradually faded into a peaceful evening, the three women remained together in comfortable, contented silence, each reflecting privately on the remarkable path that had brought them to this shared moment of gratitude and belonging. Outside, the estate grounds stretched quietly beneath the darkening sky, the same grounds that had once seemed impossibly distant and unfamiliar to a struggling young woman, simply trying to do what she believed was right. Ellen would continue managing the estate faithfully in the years that followed, expanding the charitable fund significantly, maintaining the honest, careful stewardship that had first earned Margaret's trust, and eventually passing along the same values to others within her growing circle of responsibility. She never forgot the lesson she had learned that first evening on the stone bridge, that quiet integrity, even when it seemed to offer no immediate reward, remained worth more than any temporary gain that dishonesty might have provided. Years later, when neighbors or newcomers to the estate asked about its remarkable history, Ellen would often share the story simply and humbly, never emphasizing her own role beyond what was necessary, always returning instead to the deeper truth she had come to understand so completely through her own experience. She would explain quietly that sometimes the smallest choices made in complete privacy carry the greatest weight, and that genuine faithfulness, however difficult in the moment, rarely goes unnoticed forever. And so the story of the gold pendant, once a simple object found abandoned upon an old stone bridge, became something far greater within the memory of Ashcombe, a lasting reminder that honesty, tested quietly and repeatedly through genuine hardship, ultimately reveals a character capable of carrying far more than anyone could have originally imagined, and that loyalty proven in hidden moments often becomes the very foundation for a life transformed beyond all expectation.